Lee Harvey Oswald, driving this red Ford in the area of the Tippit shooting, seems to shed some light on Scoggins going north. I have a video up called Scoggins Goes North, which deals with this issue, where William Scoggins, the cab driver, and Ted Calloway, the used car salesman, get together allegedly to go after the fleeing suspect. And this is from a Secret Service statement by Scoggins. He said that when they got into the cab, to go after the suspect, he said, "We proceeded north on Patton and possibly turned west on 10th. We cruised an area north of 10th Street looking for the man I had seen, but we did not see him. When we left the intersection of 10th and Patton, we did not go to Patton and Jefferson, but went in a northerly direction, which would be opposite from the intersection of Patton and Jefferson Streets. And that's the direction the fleeing suspect went to. That is, the fleeing suspect went to the intersection of Patton and Jefferson Streets, and Scoggins says that he and Calloway went in the opposite direction. The suspect went south, and they went north." And this is a map I think I got from John Armstrong's stuff, and I put a little extra stuff on it. It says on here, Lee Oswald parked here in 1957 blue Plymouth. This was before Armstrong had corrected that. This is where Lee Oswald was spotted by the mechanic White in the El Chico parking lot in the red Ford Falcon. And you can see down on the right-hand corner there where the green star is, that's where Tippit was shot. And you can see that this is in a northerly direction from where Tippit was shot. In fact, Scoggins said they may have gone west on 10th and north, and this is northwest. This is exactly the area that Scoggins seems to be talking about, and I think that's a hell of a coincidence that that's where Lee Harvey Oswald was spotted in the red Ford. Now, I don't know exactly what it means, but I think it's likely that Calloway and Scoggins, and remember, Calloway has the gun that the fallen officer on 10th Street had. Calloway took that gun and got in the cab and went in the opposite direction of the fleeing suspect. And that gun is a story all on its own, but it's very unclear the provenance of the gun after the shooting on 10th Street. And I think probably this has something to do with getting rid of that gun or switching that gun. I haven't got that all worked out, but I think this is probably why Oswald, or whoever it is in the red Ford, because he's got something to do with the gun that's being brought to him by Ted Calloway. And now I think I'll introduce Ed Hoffman. He's the deaf mute, the perennial clown, deaf mute. He was a perennial clown for the JFK assassination circus. He is now deceased, but he supposedly witnessed from the Stemmons Freeway. He was watching, and he supposedly saw somebody breaking down a gun and putting it into a box. And he gives different stories, and I think it's just bullshit. I think he's a red herring. But it's interesting that I think the clowns are all involved in some way, and this clown happened to work at Texas Instruments in Richardson, Texas, and coincidentally, the man that Marina Oswald married a little while after the assassination, he also worked at Texas Instruments in Richardson, Texas. And this is right near, I'm not sure, I don't know the exact addresses of these things. I expect they're pretty near, like maybe there's an industrial park or something, to where Carl Mather worked. That was also in Richardson, Texas. So the clown and the future hubby work at Texas Instruments in Richardson, Texas. And Carl Mather, the guy with the license plate, works at Collins Radio in Richardson, Texas. And Lee Harvey Oswald, according to Mary Bledsoe, when he lived at her place for about a week, she said on 2 occasions he, Oswald, alleged that he was attempting to obtain work at Texas Instruments and Collins Radio in Dallas over the weekend of October 12 to 13. So here we've got Oswald with a connection of sorts, at least evidence that he had some sort of interest in Texas Instruments and Collins Radio, and these other characters work for Texas Instruments and Collins Radio. And another connection between Oswald and Collins Radio is that George de Mohrenschildt had introduced Oswald to General Bruton. And General Bruton, at the time of their meeting, was working for Collins Radio. So all of this sounds very incestuous, and this Collins Radio Texas Instruments connection. And as I said, Ed Hoffman, the deaf mute, apparently drove a 1962 Ford Falcon. On March 27, 1977, Richard H. Freeman, Texas Instruments, Semiconductor Building, Richardson, Texas, telephone number, yada yada, telephonically advised Special Agent Redacted that he knew sign language and has communicated with Virgil E. Hoffman, a deaf mute who was employed at his building at Texas Instruments. Mr. Hoffman communicated with him by use of sign language, and Hoffman was concerned that the FBI perhaps did not fully understand what he was trying to communicate. Hoffman communicated the following information to Mr. Freeman. And subsequently, Agent Redacted, Special Agent Redacted, met with Ed Hoffman. On March 28, 1977, Virgil E. Hoffman accompanied Special Agent Redacted to Stemmons Freeway, also known as Interstate Highway 35, North Dallas, Texas. Hoffman communicated that he was driving a 1962 Ford Falcon on November 22, 1963. Of course, I have excerpted this for the point I'm looking for here. It doesn't say what color it is, but it was a 1962 Ford Falcon. And if we are to assume that Ed had a red Ford Falcon, then you can see, as I have both years represented here, that there isn't a hell of a lot of difference between the two, and it would be credible that even a mechanic might think a 1961 Ford Falcon is actually a 1962, or the other way around, I guess. That is, the mechanic might have seen the 1962 and thought it was a 1961. So here we have a possibility for where the car came from. It could have been Ed Hoffman's car. And as I said before, these people all work in Richardson, Texas, where Ed Hoffman and Carl Mather, they're not at the same company, but they're nearby, and I could only speculate, but some kind of switching of the plates might have occurred, and maybe even Carl Mather didn't even know about it. So while the evidence on this isn't strong, I think it's a possibility that perennial clown Ed Hoffman became a perennial clown because he was involved. It's not the other way around, It's not some random guy that I'm saying that I'm accusing of anything. I think he probably was involved in some way, and that he became a perennial clown because he had been involved. And I think that's probably the case with all of the perennial clowns, that they had some kind of inside connection, and that they're allowed to exploit that in their old age because they've been good little boys and girls, and they're being rewarded for their service to the evil masters who run our country. And that's the story of the Wes Wise Incident.